Okay, so you mostly all know me. I'm Claudine Close, and welcome to, this is our last program for the summer. We are going to take a hiatus in August, and then in September, actually September 8th, we're going to have a program on the history of slavery in the region. Stephen Mann is going to talk about it. Just so you know too, we are closed up in the Archive Center this month, the rest of this month, and August. But if anybody needs to contact us, we can always make it a special appointment to do research up there. Just for those people who are members of the Historical Society, just to give you an update on our consolidation plans. Both memberships voted unanimously to consolidate the Friends of Elmendorph with the Egbert Benson Historical Society of Red Hook. So the application went into the state at the end of May, and the Board of Regents hopefully will approve the application around September, we're hoping. So then we will really be able to begin planning. So ahead of us will be this challenge to create a new dynamic organization that's going to be dedicated to preserving the history of Red Hook. So I think it's very timely to have Will Tatum, our county historian, speak to us. I'm going to be taking notes. I don't know about you. For those of you who don't know Will Tatum, he was appointed last October as Dutchess County historian, and he clearly has a passion for history. He graduated from the College of William Mary with a history degree, received his master's in history from Brown, and I think is still working on his PhD in history from Brown. He was historian at the David Library of the American Revolution in Washington Crossing, Pennsylvania, worked at the Historical Society of Newburgh Bay and the Hudson Highlands before being appointed Dutchess County historian. So his experience in promoting heritage tourism and relevance of historic sites and encouraging greater access to historical archives is going to be really critical to our area's future and appreciation of history in the years ahead. And if his achievements so far are any indication, in the less than a year that you've been appointed, we have a lot of great things to look forward to. One of the projects that he came in on, sort of in the middle, but saw to fruition was this book commemorating the 350th birthday of Dutchess County, Democracy in Dutchess, Political Life in the County, 300 years, not 350. And the great thing about this is that he really made an attempt to go around the county and look for material from all over historical societies, and thankfully there are many, many images from our archives, the Red Hook Historical Society. So it's a wonderful book. It's really handsome. You can take a look. It's available at Amazon.com and at Barnes & Noble stores. So I'm going to leave it here so you can, after the program, page through it. He also has really made great progress in getting the historians and the historical societies in the county talking to each other and beginning to work together, and that's been a real plus. So I think, since all of you are history lovers, you're going to enjoy hearing sort of what his perspective is on what we have ahead of us in terms of public history. So I'm happy to have you come up and speak, and afterwards we're going to have discussion. We can mingle and have a discussion with our lemonade and cookies afterwards if you like. But let's hear from Will.
Thank you, Claudine. And thank you all for coming out on this very warm July afternoon. Oh, it's strange, when I first moved north of the Mason-Dixon line, I expected summers to be a whole lot milder than they've turned out to be, so I've had to coin the phrase, I did not move north for the summers. No, 90 degrees, that's something I'm used to in Virginia and the Carolinas, but you know, if we have to have a few days of that in order to get that nice winter chill that I do adore, it's a price I'm willing to pay. For the rest of you, I hope you have pools. So the topic today is public history, specifically what it means in general, what it means to all of you here now as part of historic Red Hook, and congratulations for that successful merger, and sort of the challenges as well as the advantages that it offers in terms of moving forward with this site and others like it. So to start off with, what is public history? Well, in short, it's an academic term that has been coined more or less over the last 30 years. It really dates back to the 1980s, and like anything academic, it's going to be constantly under deliberation and discussion about when it originates. But we can look at the 1980s as a starting point because that was one of the eras where the academic job market has been at its worst. You had programs producing MAs and PhDs far faster than the universities could pull them into teaching positions. So as a result, a lot of these highly trained and educated historians were out on the market looking for other jobs. As I'm sure we all know here, history is not a discipline renowned for granting its practitioners riches. It's not something that you go into expecting those six-figure salaries. And in general, the idea is that if you're going to make a living from history, you do it with teaching, either at the college level, the pre-college level, or in some form such as the Park Service. But as you can see with me, there are other positions out there, specifically and especially in historic sites, that do offer employment for professionally trained historians. And that's really what you saw in the 1980s, is for the first time there was a glut of these professionals on the market. They could not be absorbed in the universities, so they went out and they populated the national park system, the state park system, and the private parks and historical societies. Now, as universities are wont to do, once something new comes along, they like to coin a title for it and then usually begin at least a program, if not a separate department, to study it. So by the late 1980s, the early 1990s, the universities were picking up on the fact that many of their alumni were going into these positions, and so they coined the term of public history, which in its simplest form means bringing history to the public. Because as all of you know, academics tend to write for other academics. We have the quip in the university setting of you're writing for the 12 other people on the planet who study what you study. General audience authors, the ones who write these popular volumes, also tend to write for specific audiences, whether it be military history, social history, women's history. They have a specific target audience in mind. Public history is about reaching out to the general public on the broadest possible level, appealing to as many interests as you can, and bringing them into your historic sites, your museums, and your historical societies as much as possible. The real bottom line, as it is turned out in practice, is that public history is about making history come alive for the public, which, as we'll see, even though it ties into older ideas, it is something new and distinct in and of itself. So in terms of thinking about bringing history to the public, your first ideas about how this works might lead you to think that the 1980s seems like a pretty young date for public history as a discipline to emerge. And it's true, you had efforts to bring history to the public at large long before then. Most of our historical societies in the county and in the nation in general were founded in the 1960s, during that great era not only of radical change in terms of development of highways and neighborhoods and automobiles, but as a result of that, also the great era of destruction of historic properties, loss of documents. So that was the time when a generation of new folks in the field came up to charter these organizations to preserve structures like the Elmendorph Inn here today. But before that even, you had a rush towards what we might generally loosely call public history in the late 19th and the opening decades of the 20th century. For example, our own Dutchess County Historical Society was founded in 1914, celebrating its 100th anniversary next year. So there were these ongoing efforts at public history before the 1980s. And in fact, if you go back far enough, the entire practice of historic sites and modern historic preservation is usually dated to starting in 1850 with New York State's purchase of Washington's headquarters at Newburgh, which was the first time that a public entity preserved a site for exhibit to the general public at large. So what's different between then and what we do now? Well, if you look at those first historic sites that opened, they were more or less a place for history in the most general sense. For example, with Washington's headquarters, if you go and look at their collections today, you won't see items that are specifically or particularly related entirely to Washington or the Revolutionary War. It became sort of a depot for any sort of historical artifact or historical papers from that area. So the collections there, which are on display now, include items from the Civil War, the World Wars, from various collections that travelers amassed from going to Africa, to Egypt, to Australia, to other places like that. So these first historic sites were really just beacons for history in general. When you have your first historical societies really starting to get going in generally the late 19th and early 20th centuries, though you have earlier examples here and there, they are mostly run by the local elites, people from the first families of any given area who are concerned about the loss of memory in the face of the dramatic social upheavals that were just beginning at that period in time, as well as the loss of structures, because as within the 50s and 60s, in the opening decades of the 20th century, you had innovations in technology, and particularly transportation, building approaches, and whatnot, that were leading to either the intentional destruction of a lot of historic sites or just demolition by neglect, because who wants to live in the old house and the old style when you could have a perfectly wonderful new structure built right next to it? You see that a lot more in the South than you do necessarily up here, but it's still in action. Now, these early historical societies did a good job of going around gathering up local information, preserving historic structures as best they could, though in this case, for example, if you look at Dutchess, you have the work of our own Helen Wilkinson Reynolds, who is probably still the greatest Dutchess County historian on record. She went around the county documenting early examples of Dutch and English colonial architecture, fact-checking the earlier county histories, and in general, pulling as much information together as she could, and as the rest of the Historical Society could. But even with the wealth of material that they pulled together, the idea there was more on amassing and preserving rather than necessarily bringing this information to the public. And there was also a certain bias towards historical preservation during this period. For example, most of the early work on Dutch houses here in the county focused on the best preserved examples, rather than looking at all of the examples and trying to determine, for example, why has this house remained in its configuration from the date of initial construction versus why this home has been significantly modernized. Those were major issues from our current modern perspective that were sort of dropped along the way. So the first historical societies did great work in terms of collecting and preserving, but they still weren't all the way there in terms of our modern ideas encapsulated in public history. So what about that second great wave of historical societies that came up in the 50s and 60s? Well, they tended to follow the pattern set by the first historical societies, but they did it on a more popular level. So their intention was, let's save structures of meaning to the community. It doesn't matter really if they are perfect examples of X, Y, or Z form of architecture. Let's save all the documents we can, not just the documents from the most important families. And this was also the start of doing a lot of programming for the public at large. It's not just focusing on your membership, it's about having lectures, festivals like Hard Scrabble Day, other things where you can bring in the public at large. Now, the difference between what happened then and what has happened as a result of public history is that the folks who were doing most of that work in the 50s and 60s were generally not trained historians. They were folks from all sorts of walks of life who had a passion for history. But as a result of the lack of university training, they had to reinvent the wheel over and over again, individually and also generationally, because that first group of folks in the 50s and 60s gave way to ones in the 70s and 80s, and so on and so forth. So there was no real standardization of approach, practice, and methodology across the board at that time. And it also made it very difficult as a result to have emblematic change across the board. So what happens that makes the 1980s in public history so important is that you have this large influx of people who do have standardized training from university curricula, and who are also focused on taking that training and using it to really bring out the most vibrant and human aspects of historic sites and historical collections. So, for example, I'm sure many of you have taken house tours where you're led through the rooms and your attention is drawn to the beautiful paintings, to the furniture, to the other architectural elements. It's more of an antiques tour necessarily than it is a historic site tour, because it tells you about the stuff, but it doesn't tell you about the people who use the stuff or how the stuff can put you into their world. From the 1970s, but again picking up in the 1980s, you get this idea that it needs to be programming less focused on the material and more focused on the culture that these places represent. And in fact, if you look at the back corner of the room here, you can see a fairly typical example of that sort of input and process, insofar as you have preserved there an exposed portion of the wall, which shows you exactly how it was put together, how all of the pieces fit together. And that's part of this idea of using the material to tell you about the culture of the period, to say, well, let's look at how these construction elements differ from how we do it today or how they did it before that period, and it gives you a window into the practice and the ideas of a former age. And that's really the power of public history today for all of us here and also nationally, is it provides a set of approaches that can allow us to more efficiently and effectively reach out to the public. Because again, the mission's not so much preservation, it's not so much collection in and of itself as ends. These are more part of a process that includes interpretation and then public education. And that's where the public history discipline has really grown over the past 30 years to help with bringing out some standard approaches that can be used in order to get as much as you can out of bringing the public in and showing them how significant your site is for their lives as well as for understanding the local area. Now, this is the part where generally I would tell you all about the things that you could do going by public history practice to really make everything come alive. But happily, with Historic Red Hook, formerly the Red Hook Historical Society, Egbert Benson, and the Friends of the Elmendorph Inn, I don't have to do that because you guys are already doing so much of the right stuff. In fact, you're an example that I hold up across the county as to show how the sorts of programs I mentioned can successfully be done because they're already being done up here. So a few things that pop out to mind: your lecture series, your tavern nights, your program at Hard Scrabble Days, and also your educational outreach to the schools. Those are the four main bases of any public history operation. Your lecture series is a way to appeal to those audiences that want to hear about history. So you provide the opportunity for them to come out, to listen, to speak with experts in the field, and to access that specialized knowledge in a more human form than they would if they just went on the internet or if they went down to the bookstore and purchased a volume. You also get that with your educational programs by bringing the kids in, showing them around, explaining the significance of the inn and its contents to them in terms of this is how you can look at the past and understand its relevance to you. The other two things that you do, the Hard Scrabble Days and the Tavern Nights, are important for expanding beyond just the educational mission to really make your historic site part of the fabric of the community, because these are very much community events. They're about bringing people in, showing them the structure and operation, and not necessarily putting too much of an emphasis on history, because we think sometimes that because it's a historic site, everything has to be history related, like chapter and verse. It almost has to be a school lesson. It doesn't. Just getting people in, allowing them to see the structure, and allowing them also to become engaged in a modern community way does, in many respects, more work for your cause in terms of getting the information out there to people than any number of lectures or school programs, because the real bottom line is get people in the door and get them to come back again. So really, you guys have got the basics covered here, which Makes my discussion today significantly shorter, which I'm sure we're all happy about given the weather outside, though I'm very thankful for the AC in here. The only area really that I could highlight for potential expansion would be to think about doing some immersive history programs here. You've done a little bit of that already with some of your tours and other programs that feature people in costume. So you can expand on that by planning, for example, tavern days or other living history days that bring in people who have museum quality costumes and a very detailed knowledge of the site, who can take people through and give them a blow-by-blow description of how this would have operated in 1760 as a tavern, how this would have operated circa 1812 as the government community meeting place. So it's something to consider, something that I'm happy to help you all with. But the description of the talk did mention a couple of other things that I have to touch on before we finish up here today, most specifically the challenges of the digital age and sort of how you can address those. Now, around the turn of the last century, so in the late 90s, early aughts, as I guess we should call them now, there was this idea that history has lost its relevance because of the computer, because of the internet, the general digital boom. What can people from the 19th and the 18th century tell us that will in any way, shape, or form be helpful or useful when they didn't have iPods or smartphones or all of these other technologies that so shape our lives and also the lives of the younger generations today? Well, thankfully, that fear has turned out to be baseless, because the lessons that history has are timeless. They're about the human experience. They're about reality. And that's important because as wonderful as the digital world may be, it's a virtual world. It is not flesh and blood. You can't, unless you're knocking on the side of your computer, touch it. And as a result, that generates a certain crisis in meaning, especially with the younger folks who might have their heads plugged into Xboxes and whatnot, but at the end of the day, they still need something solid to grasp onto. And history is peerless in terms of providing that, because you have the structures, you have the material culture, the items that you have displayed here, you have the letters, the other documents, the things that show that the past is real, it existed, and there are people who face these same challenges then as we do today in a general way. Now, as much as we have more or less overcome the threat of the digital age as it was posed in the 1990s and the early aughts, we do still face challenges across the board. And there are two really to be concerned about. One is funding. Funding is going to be a perpetual challenge in history because it's not something that is viewed as a money maker. As my computer science housemates explained to me in grad school, their stipends were larger than mine because they did things that made money. And if you do things that make money, you get paid more money. Now, you all are very lucky here in terms of having the rental property attached that provides a revenue source in addition to membership dues. On the other hand, there's this idea that somehow everything we do in history ought to be free, which would be great if the cost of doing all of these programs was free. But as we all know, it isn't. You have time, you have materials, you have labor. Costs can add up over time. So you should not feel bad about either very pointedly asking for donations or charging a modest fee to attend your programs, or best of all, having specific fundraising programs out there, because history costs money to do, and it should also cost money at a certain level to experience. We do as much as we can across the board for the public for free, but there's a point at which the books have to be balanced, and there's no sense in being shy about it, because there are plenty of corporations, for-profit entities out there who are making money hand over fist. Just look at the History Channel or any number of the tour programs that'll do everything from a day down in New York City to 3 weeks down the Nile. Money's being made in history by the for-profit sector. There's no reason why the non-profit sector can't take steps to at least cover costs, and it's possible to do so. The other more pressing issue in my mind is membership. So this is not a Red Hook issue. This is not a Dutchess County issue. This is not a New York issue. This is a continental issue. It's a global issue. It's a fact that in the Western world, we're not doing a whole lot of good to replenish our numbers in the history sector. So you'll, for example, have kids who are very interested in what we're doing, but they get dropped along the way, particularly in the teenage years. And then you don't generally see them being picked up again as young families, which is the sort of core areas for recruitment. The three are when they're kids, when they have kids, and then when they're retired and have time to actually go out and attend lectures like today. So in terms of the membership challenge, my suggestion to all of you is that you need to look at your programs geared towards young folks, school kids and young adults. The most important aspects of that being have program offerings that bring them to the site. Then make sure that you have jobs that they can do and positions that they can fill within your organization. Now, this does not mean that you have to have 9-year-old board members. It does mean that you have to think a little bit out of the box in terms of how can you break down an event so that there are things for your young adults to do and then feel like they've accomplished something. Because if you can recruit them and then retain them through the teenage years, you'll generally have them as part of the community going forward. Now, the flip side of that is children's programming will also help recruit the young families. Because today, more than any other period, I think, in history, you have stresses placed on families that are just eliminating the possibility and the opportunity for group time. So you generally have both parents working, you have the children with multiple after-school and during-school activities. So it's even to the point now where the formerly sacrosanct evening meal is generally either eaten on the go or only features a handful of the family instead of the whole set coming together and seeing each other at least once a day. We've seen across the board in terms of the tourism studies that programs at historic sites, particularly programs that have components aimed towards children, are one of those occasions when the young families make a concerted effort to get out because it offers someone or something for everyone in the family. You have your adult targeted programs that keep moms and dads entertained, and then of course they love anything that's going to provide enrichment for the children. And that can be something as simple as having a table with a few agricultural instruments, let's say peelers, on it, and asking the kids to guess what type of fruit or vegetable does this peel. Now it's something small, it's simple to do, but it has a huge impact because again, it brings history to life for the visitors. And that is, again, the bottom line of everything we do here and at all of our other sites throughout the county, throughout the state, and throughout the nation. Because it's just not enough to say, here's the stuff. You've got to tell them why the stuff matters. So to sum up, public history is a great big, fluffy, academical term for the simple process, although it's an involved process, but relatively straightforward of bringing the history to the people in a way that brings the past alive. It's got a lot of methods involved in it that streamlines the process of execution for all of us because we then don't have to go and reinvent the wheel every time we want to put a program together. And it also provides a tie-in for gathering practices that have worked elsewhere and bringing them in to work here. We've managed to survive the great transition to the digital age with our historic sites and our infrastructure intact, but we're still facing those two big issues of funding. So you should not be shy about going after grants, having fundraising initiatives, charging modest sums for your programs, and also membership, where again, you need to especially focus on the audiences that you might not be reaching as effectively right now, which is across the board, children being the most important. So with that, my comments are over with for today, and I'm happy to take any questions you might have. Yes, ma'am.
We have an archive room which has materials from the past.
Mm-hmm.
Can you address emails and digital photographs, how history is going to be affected, I consider negative in the future?
Well, that's something that we're struggling with actually at the county and the state level at present. State Archives is very much focused on it, and as a result, so are we. because there was this idea at one point that email meant, because it's not saved, it's not usually in a sort of preservation format, that 10, 20, 30, 100 years from now, you'd have a great gap, which future historians might call the electric age, because one broken hard drive could eliminate all of the emails and other standard correspondence for years at a time. There are programs that are being developed to save email and digital archival formats so that the files won't degrade over time. There are also practices being evolved on how to do that yourself if you don't want to purchase the programs. For example, at the county level, we have a program that's part of our server which automatically archives a copy of every incoming and outgoing email. So measures are being taken. The likelihood is that we're going to see better survivability of that resource from here on out than we would from, say, the 1990s and the first decade of this century. But it's something to consider. Essentially, you have to put together a set of standards that says these are emails that need to be saved and these are emails that don't. The county and the state levels, we have these things called retention schedules, which break down records by type and explain how long you have to save them for. Now, usually the impetus for saving them is a legal one. So it's, if a court case comes up, you need to have these records for 5 years because that's what the courts have determined they need, whereas these records are permanent because you're likely to have them, for example, the minutes of the county legislature have to be kept on file forever because you never know when you might have a legal case that requires you to go back to the 50s or the 40s to find some element of precedent. So in terms of your practice here, I would say think about the sorts of emails that you need to retain organizationally to document what you're doing. So the simpler emails of like, we'll hold the meeting at 3 o'clock on Friday, you might not need, but the emails that set out policy you probably do want to save. And you can either save those in a digital format, or if you've got the storage space, you can always print them out. In terms of, yes, we don't want to print them out. We do want to save them digitally. The idea is if it's born digital, it should be saved digital. And that's what we're actually putting into practice at the county level now and what the state has largely done as well. Because I can tell you in our record center down in Poughkeepsie, maybe about 1/8 of it is actually archives in terms of old historical documents, and most of the rest is paper from the 1970s and 80s that is just being stored until its retention period, and sometimes print-offs of things like email for the 1990s and the past 13 years at least. But you want to keep it digitally, and in terms of digital photographs, your best thing is to take them at the highest pixel setting that you can get. And if you're digitizing photographs, which is a good way to go to make backup copies just in case the original gets destroyed, or use copies so that you can keep the original in a good preservation condition and then give someone a digital copy to examine. The state archives, again, has on their website standards for how many pixels, the various other sorts of settings that you get on a scanner to use there. And Claudine has my contact information. I'd be glad to email you a link to that. But going forward, the preservation of emails, photographs, and other digital material is thankfully not as grim a prospect as it has been really since the invention of email in the first place.
So is microfilm going out of favor?
Microfilm is going out of favor. I mean, there's no debate that it has longer shelf life, since a good microfilm reel is supposed to have a half-life of at least 500 years if it's kept, and we're talking about the master microfilm, not the use copy, but if it's kept in a proper environment, which is not always the case. Microfilm is just difficult to use. It requires an apparatus of fairly significant size, and it's not word searchable. And that's really the advantage of having all of your material digitized, is then if you either have optical character recognition or if you've got manuscript documents, interns and volunteers who go through and transcribe them and then feed them in, word searchability has increased access and usefulness of records beyond anyone's ability to quantify it. We're seeing it with the scholarship that's being done today on, for example, newspapers. that have been digitized and turned into online catalogs and databases. You're pulling out all sorts of information and being able to do history that simply you could not do 10, 15, 30 years ago. So it really is the wave of the future to go all digital and to generally stay away from microfilm.
That leads to the question of, you mentioned newspapers, because that's the number we're trying to figure right now. There's some of us, we love the original newspaper, and you can find out so much about history of a town from reading the local newspaper. So what is your advice as far as, you know, if they have been digitized, do we just chuck them?
Well, the usual answer to that question of if they've been digitized, you chuck them, is yes, you chuck them, because the idea is you only really want one core copy of a record. We have in the county, for example, what's called the Department of Record. It's not an actual department in and of itself. It is the idea that if you're the department making the record, you're the department responsible for keeping a permanent record of it. So if, for example, the newspaper or its descendant paper has digitized all of their holdings, then they become the entity of record, which means that you don't have to hold on to your stuff. Now, emphasis on have to, and that being the simple answer, because the more complicated answer is sometimes you'll have a newspaper that digitizes all of their archives and then loses it. Sometimes you'll have a newspaper that digitizes their archives, decides to put them online, and then decides to take them offline and not grant public access to them. So until you can be certain that whatever newspaper records you have are in a sustainable digital format that's going to be accessible to the public, it's more or less a good idea to hold on to them, even though it again provides a crunch on space, and it raises the question of should you digitize these yourself, and that opens the door for good conversations with the newspaper editors to let them know that there's interest in this stuff.
I noticed that newspapers from the 1860s are almost in the same condition that they were when they were printed.
Yes.
So I would say that something like that you might want to save as opposed to something from the 1890s that's just crumbles.
That is one approach to it if you're looking at the newspapers as artifacts, and the reason behind that is there was a change in the type of paper used from rag paper to pulp paper, and rag paper is great. If you have it in the proper conditions, it will last practically forever. Pulp paper, as you've seen with any paperback that you've got from the 70s, turns yellow, smells bad, and eventually falls apart, especially if it's newsprint. So if you've got examples of older newspapers, I mean, anything over 100 years it has a dual nature. I mean, every historic document, even the paper that this lecture notes are printed out on, is both a document in terms of a way to convey information, but it's also an artifact because it's an example of something created by a human being for a specific purpose, which is sort of the general definition of that. If it's the print off from today, it's not an artifact that we necessarily put a whole lot of stock by and want to save, especially if we have a digital version of it. If it's a newspaper from 1863, then you have a whole different set of issues that come into play, especially if it's in good condition.
Just looking at, this big, it's a whole different experience.
Yeah.
It is, which is why, again, the simple answer of yes, you can throw your newspapers away is, again, a simple answer. It's really a decision that requires consideration of a range of variables because you may have newspaper articles and editions that are of significance for the locality that need to be saved in their original printed format, regardless of whether they're available online or not. Because, as was indicated earlier, this digital stuff has a huge Achilles heel, which is if there's an electrical malfunction, then it's gone. So even when we digitize things down to the county record office or up at state archives, we hold on to the paper stuff. When we start digitizing, for example, the Court of Common Pleas records, which are the oldest that we have, they stretch back to 1721, you won't see me throwing them in the trash can afterwards. The point of the digitization is to make them available via the wonderful worldwide net and to keep the originals in a good preservation environment instead of trucking them back and forth to the reading room all the time. I'd suggest a similar practice here. So it's something that, you know, committees are a dirty word, I know, and an even dirtier concept, but it's something that's worth some good committee work to figure out, you know, what are your standards for preservation of that material, and, you know, what do you want to focus for preservation and what do you not, because the fact of the matter is space is finite.
Yeah.
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, is any effort being made at all to bring history to life, as the words that you used, in our schools, rather than the straight da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da, which it gets pretty boring after a while, then they tune off, and then, as you said, they don't participate in groups like this. What can we do to make that alive?
Well, you can always pressure your state-level politicians because the core curriculum doesn't leave, apparently, any room or funding for field trips anymore, which used to be, at least when I was coming up, a core part of making things like history come alive. There are groups and individuals across the board who've made a big effort to get into the classrooms, but the way that the core curriculums are being done now, the pressure being put on the teachers to teach to the test rather than to teach to the mind and the real breadth of information out there, makes those opportunities increasingly difficult to put into practice, which is why places like the Elmendorph are so important, because if you can't get the school groups in, at least you stand a good chance of bringing in the families, and in that way the kids can still get their educational enrichment and can still learn that history is not, as has often been told to me on plane trips and train trips when people find out that I'm a historian. It's not just names and dates and places that have to be memorized, it is the story of where we've come from. And again, who we are today, because that's the sort of big take-home point for the people outside of our discipline in terms of those who aren't, for example, here today as enthusiasts. So when you study the past, you learn about the people then, but in so doing, you learn more about who you are and who we all are collectively today. And unfortunately, a standardized, state-regulated curriculum is always going to fall short of that goal, which is why places like the Elmendorph Inn are so essential for that educational process. Education doesn't begin and end at the classroom door any more than history can be chained to this podium. So.
Well, in the 1970s, I was involved in the local newspaper project that we put on microfilm. Now, I understand it can be digitized.
It can.
Is that costly? Is that something that we would be looking for grants for?
It's always look for grants. Look for grants for anything, because the more of your revenue stream that you can get coming from outside sources, the better. You know, even if you're sitting happily with rent coming in and fundraising coming in, the big lesson of the nonprofit sector as far as funding goes is you can never have enough of it. And the more you can draw on resources outside of your core base, the better, because you've got big expenses in terms of upkeeping historic properties, maintaining your research, all that sort of thing. In terms of the microfilming or the digitization of microfilm, it can be relatively inexpensive, it can be relatively expensive depending on what you want from it. Now, there are operations that literally work outside of people's garages where they will take your microfilm, scan it into a JPEG or a TIFF format, and then, you know, charge you 5 cents a frame for it, essentially. Very, very cheap. But then what you essentially have is literally a digital version of the microfilm without a lot of the advantages of a digital. Exactly. Now, if you want it searchable, that's going to cost extra money. It's also going to depend on the nature of what you have microfilm. For example, from the sound of it, most of the documents on your microfilm are probably typed or printed.
Whatever they did in newspapers, yeah.
That's easy because a computer can read printed words. So that's where optical character recognition comes in, is with printed forms. That makes it much cheaper to digitize it and to make it word searchable. Manuscript stuff, no computer can read human handwriting, especially not handwriting like mine. So you actually have to have a human being sitting there transcribing it into like a Word file, which is then fed into the software to create a word searchable database. So for example, if you go on the Library of Congress webpage and you go to the George Washington papers and you search them, it is not actually searching the digital images, which in that case were actually digital images of microfilm. It's not searching through the handwriting. What it is searching is the transcripts that have been made by previous interns who've gone through and typed everything up tidily. So for the sort of project you're talking about, it's on the spectrum of expensive to cheap. It's relatively inexpensive to get a good usable, word searchable digital product out of that. If you had microfilm of 19th and 18th century documents, that's going to take more effort.
I have one last question because I know there are other questions I have actually, but maybe we can do it over lemonade and cookies. But do you have any models of programs from your experience in either other societies in Dutchess County or your former experiences that really have appeal to the generation that is totally digital these days? Is there some, I mean, for those of us who kind of manage these organizations, we aren't on Twitter and maybe we're on Facebook, maybe we're not, but is there something that will bring in, there's this gap, I mean, the 20s, the people in their 20s basically, they aren't going to come into school tours and they don't have their own kids yet, so do we just sort of ignore them?
No, it's a two-part answer to that question, and the first part is actually promotion. Doesn't matter what kind of program you have, you need to be able to promote it effectively, and I'm here to tell you promotion is very difficult. Not insofar as it's difficult to do, but it's difficult insofar as all of the various variables you have to think about in terms of promotion. Because as you've said, it's not just a newspaper anymore, you've got to get it out on the digital waves as much as possible. So you need your Facebook, you need your Twitter, you need your email broadcast lists, you need to get it in the local paper and their digital edition, which incidentally you need to look at the fine print of any ad that you post, because a lot of the time they'll put it in one but not the other. So really you've got to promote the heck out of anything, and before you can even promote an event, you've got to promote your digital presence. So you need to get the word out there that Historic Red Hook has a Twitter page, it has a Facebook page, it has all of these other digital presences, and get folks to sign up for it.
And then you have to have stuff happening.
And then you have to have stuff happening. Well, when I was a freshman at the College of William and Mary, Virginia, among other things that happened to me that year, was sitting in my Intro to Medieval History course, and the first day the professor looked at all of us and said, "Why do we study history?" And we all looked at each other because we were freshmen and we had learned in high school that #1 survival trick is you don't say anything when the teacher asks you a question. Thankfully, he was prepared for this, and he said there are really two schools of thought for why you study history. First is you study it because it is so relevant. You can learn from the past. You can find the answer to any conundrum you have today back then, which to a certain extent is true, provided you have a spin doctor to really work on the specifics. The other side, he said, is we study history because it has absolutely no relation to what we do today. We study it because it's weird, it's disconnected, it makes us think thoughts that we otherwise wouldn't.
Escape.
Yeah. And of course, the middle ground is it's a little bit of both, because you can draw a lot of information out of the past that is helpful, but it's also equally helpful to learn that there are other ways to look at these life equations that don't pop up to us based on our own experience. So that's really the answer to how you get the 20-somethings in. Obviously it's best if you can hook them during their school days as preteens or as early teens, and then just keep them in the field. And God knows we need that, because I want to retire one of these days and I need someone to replace me who's preferably of the younger variety. So the other way to do it is to present the 20-somethings with the opportunity to learn things that may be relevant to them, but also to explore the sort of weird, new, unfamiliar side of the past. And I'm a little bit biased in this regard because I've been doing reenacting and living history for 13 years now, so I'm very fond of it. But on the other hand, there is simply no substitute for having people in funny old clothes standing in the room ready to talk to you and answer your questions and engage you. Because if we walked into this room right now with just a tour guide in modern clothes, we might get a standardized spiel, we might look around at all these wonderful things and look at the tags and whatnot, but it's a very passive experience. The portraits are not jumping out of the wall to engage you. If you took the 3 core rooms of this building and filled them with reenactors representing the 3 core periods that they do, and then take people in starting in 1760 with what is it like to walk into a stagecoach inn on the post road, and then bring them all the way through to here to talk about what is it like to set up a new community in 1812 and split off from Rhinebeck, which doesn't really look fondly upon people splitting off for it. It's the colonial Williamsburg model. Some people refer to it as Williamsburg on wheels. That's considered derogatory because that speaks more to the sort of dog and pony show style in which you can do this. If you do it quality, with motivated individuals who are invested in the time period and the site, it can be amazing because you have people walk in and they're immediately engaged by these folks in period clothing who will tell them and then ask them questions to draw them out of their shells, which is not something you usually get with a standard tour or a static display. And this building is perfectly set up for that type of program. You've got the documents in terms of outlining the history. You have a wonderful restoration. You have all of the gear in terms of the furniture and whatnot that you need. All you really need to do is add motivated people with the right clothes, shake, and serve.
Well, we're going to invite Will. I think he'll be a reenactor for us. So
thank you very much, Claudine.
I really appreciate it.
Thank you all.
So please join us in the tap room. There's lemonade and cookies and Robin did get a chance to talk to Will, so you can talk to him in the other room. So thanks again.
You're very welcome.
We're going to be in touch as we go through this process of figuring out what historic rhetoric is all about.
Yes, it's always an adventure.
Yeah.
A process that never ends.